So, Cotton, are you going to make me number one?
No, you're not a monster.
Well, you wouldn't say that if you knew all the things that I've done.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, with Wilds coming up quite soon, especially as someone with no concept of what monsters may or may not even be returning for the game, it is the perfect time for me to do one last check-in with you all to stop and talk about what my current top 10 monsters are in the entire Monster Hunter series up to this point, especially for the sake of contrast in case it changes at all once Wilds releases, and honestly I absolutely hope that it will, because that would just mean that there are more absolutely incredible monsters to love in the series. That said, these are of course based on my own opinions. You can agree or disagree, and feel free to argue with me down in the comments why your choices are just factually better than my own. Without further ado then, up at number 10 is Ahtal-Ka. Among all of the final bosses, this one is my favorite as a monster, as a creature. I often go back between Shara Ishvalda and Ahtal-Ka for this slot on the list, but as more time passes from Iceborne, my thoughts push more towards Ahtal-Ka, for sure. This fight is the epitome of everything Generations Ultimate was offering, a really high-paced, super wacky, but equally badass version of what Monster Hunter is. A giant, golden, beautiful, shining mantis creature that collects bits of fortresses that she destroys, to then create not only her own habitat, but then also a full-on mech that she controls and pilots, a weapon of war and mass destruction. Some monsters use tools to a certain extent, but this monster straight up uses webbing to activate a big dragon-shaped fucking battle bot, and then even when she's not inside of this thing, she is using her webs to fling herself around the arena. She is setting up Mission Impossible laser trap level overlaps of webbing, or just straight up throwing around metal girders at the start, which then escalates to throwing goddamn water wheels and eventually even dragonators, full-on dragonators that she flings at you like a javelin. It is an unforgettable experience, it is a gorgeous fight, and an absolute masterpiece of a monster. Moving on to 9th then is Basilgeuse, who has slowly been growing on me more and more and more. I've always enjoyed Basilgeuse. I've always been a Basilgeuse liker. I mean, his theme, the bombing run, his blood-chilling roar, the fact that he drops explosive bits of himself in general as well. But over time, when I look back on World and Iceborne, some of my most memorable bits of that game are of Basilgeuse's theme kicking in before you even get a visual on him. Then you look up to the sky, and he descends like an angel out of heaven to smite the non-believers, and the non-believers are goddamn everyone. Over time, I built up this sort of personality for him in my head that he just fucking loves hunting and he loves people, because he essentially had a mechanic where he would just go to any monster who did a roar on the map. So in my mind, he was just really excited to be a part of things when he showed up. He wasn't attacking you, he wasn't being territorial or predatory, he just wanted to hang out, and it just so happens that he has explosive bits that fall off his body. I mean, it's not his fault, right? And then when you start beating him up, of course he has to fight back. Then he also has just a really big squishy head, but an absolutely tiny little goblin face that's just on the very end of it, and it's just so adorable. And so all of that, on top of just a very memorable fight in general, is why he's got to be in this slot for me today. Next up in 8th place then we have Celtis Queen, and this is just one of the most creative encounters in the entire Monster Hunter series. A crazy scorpion tank beetle monster, which in itself is of course a wild thing to look at for the first time, that just sort of grows on you a little bit as you get used to, especially as you fight her and actually watch her use her tail, or even just the way that she uses each part of herself as a weapon as well. But then comes the fact that she always has Celtis as a bonus monster around her too, and then they just sort of have a fusion dance into one being, basically, with Celtis flying and carrying the queen into the air so he can drop her on top of you, or charge at you with her horn held forwards, and this whole concept is simultaneously super funny and also really cool. Like, it's full on two monsters like Voltroning into one to fight you using both of their strengths together, and it feels like this really cool sort of choreographed dance of teamwork and partnership until she just throws him off of her head, or the rare interaction where she will straight up drink him like a milkshake, killing it instantly before she heals, and then summons a fresh Celtis to work beside. It is silly, it is cool, it's unique as all hell, and I love it. Moving up to 7th, then let's talk about Yama-Kurai. This is the origin species of Yamasukami, who I've always loved his concept alone, being a gigantic floating balloon octopus with weirdly human teeth that also look deeply concerningly unclean, and he just sort of sucks in entire ecosystems, not out of like a destructive impulse or even for the sake of consuming animals and meat, but because he just wants to eat soil. That's his main intake. And when you're as big as he is, you need to consume a lot of soil relatively quickly. You need to do it efficiently. So he creates like a vacuum within his mouth to suck in soil from the ground, which also takes up things with it like trees, plants of all kinds, and even living creatures and animals like even thunderbugs that straight up end up living in his mouth. All that said, the last time that Yamasukami was in a Monster Hunter game was literally second generation, and this fight was definitely cool and interesting, but he was essentially locked stationary to a couple of floors of a tower, which was very, very limiting. Bring in Yama-Karai then, and this is the frontier origin species version of Yamasukami, meaning this is like the ancient originator of its evolutionary line. Super similar concept behind it, but now he's gnarlier, he's a bit rougher around the edges, a little bit more chaotic looking, and he can change seasons mid-fight by having the leaves on his body turn into some nice warm colors and then entering autumn mode. He can create twisters, he can pull up full-on gigantic mounds of rock even with you standing on them. The fight gets crazy, and most importantly to me, it's an actual fight for this creature. He is in an actual zone, moving around naturally. And sure, he's big and it's a little bit awkward, but it's leagues ahead of his original fight for sure. After that, in the 6th place, Pukei-Pukei. This is my favorite non-base version of a monster by such a ridiculous amount. Sure, Yama-Karai technically is a variation monster, but that's mostly just because it takes a non-existent fight from regular Yamasukami and makes it actually relevant, whereas Pukei-Pukei takes a pretty solid poison, lizardy, bird-like flying wyvern that eats out of poison cups to shoot poison gas at you, and then transforms it entirely through a beautiful metamorphosis into a phoenix-colored creature that sucks the moisture out of the mushrooms in the Coral Highlands and then distributes that water to the people through both its face and its tail like a two-headed garden hose. Conceptually, that is of course incredible design for a monster, and visually this monster is fantastic too, but then the actual moveset that this monster is given is just absolutely next level and of the quality that you would expect from like an Apex tier monster at minimum. Things like Rathalos, Diablos, or a Dogoron difficulty tier, with things like a beam attack that it can split into two by putting its tongue up in between it, making two separate beams that expand in a cone, which is so cool, and then even a full-on super attack moment where it flies up above and starts doing a spiraling water hose that you have to then roll through and get under to keep doing damage. The whole fight, start to finish, is one of my favorites in the series, and I do think maybe if it was a fully unique monster instead of a subspecies, it might be closer to the top of my list, but for the fact it's a subspecies that was already based off of an existing monster to begin with that they had to fiddle around with, this is one of the most creative things that they have ever made. Following that up in 5th place is Namielle, my favorite Elder Dragon in the series. Namielle left me in absolute awe when I first saw her while playing through Iceborne, an absolutely gorgeous monster with an aesthetic somewhere between a Disney villain and the creepiest possible deep sea monster that you could imagine. And then they matched that with a beautifully unique, almost manta ray shaped wing style for her, and they gave her the ability to fold the wingtips in like jellyfish tentacles while flying to form one of the most beautifully executed animations in the game. And this is on top of the fact that even just in concept, she is an Elder Dragon inspired by super deep sea monsters who outputs water into the Coral Highlands, which is essentially a deep sea themed map without the actual ocean on top of it. Thematically, it works so incredibly well. Aesthetically, it's incredible as well. And then the fight itself, some people get irritated with the fact that the waves move you around, but I think that's part of the charm of the fight. And then you get to the fact that she also has thunder element and can electrify her own water pools to create delayed steam explosions, all leading up to her amazing super attack as well. She is just awesome through and through. Next up in 4th place is Rakna-Kadaki, who I think is definitely even higher in my regards over the last couple of years too. This monster was the embodiment of Rise's biggest mechanic, the wire bug. Players got access to this funky method of movement, traversal, and combat, and when you first meet Rakna-Kadaki, not only is she the first Temno-Saren in a whole generation, an absolutely gorgeous assassin spider inspired creature covered in a web fiber coating to protect her sort of spindlier bits, and she has little small spider monsters as well that she can not only order around like a little bodyguard squad doing her bidding, but she can even straight up use them like wire bugs, anchoring a web onto them and then using that to pull herself around the area in extremely unique ways. She then also has the added bonus of a super unique interaction too, where if you are hit by a fire attack while afflicted by the web status, it will cause an even longer stun, do a bunch of damage, and you will just watch yourself sort of melting to the ground a bit. And this comes from her unique mix of having web attacks and really cool flamethrower abilities, then capping off with her super attack hanging from the ceiling and everything like that too. It's just a really top quality monster with that perfect layer of silliness on top that I love too. Then moving up to 3rd place, we have Gos Harag. I love bears. They are tied for my favorite real life animal with crabs, which I also have an unhealthy obsession with. But bear monsters have existed in the series for a very long time, and for the most part, unless we count things like Red Helm Arzuros, there has never been an innately threatening giant bear monster. I love Arzuros, don't get me wrong, but because he's a lower threat level creature, he simply has a less complex moveset in general, and doesn't really really stick around much longer term in the cycle of a Monster Hunter game, as people tend not to repeat the hunts of lower tier monsters in a given generation. Rag, however, is essentially the apex of his area, and he gets one of the coolest movesets that I can imagine as well as a result, using beams of ice to create weapons on his own arms, going from a sort of sword and shield set up at the beginning of the fight, to then turning each arm into a greatsword once you start to get him lower. The specific pace and rhythm of this fight, for whatever reason, just really grabbed me in base Monster Hunter Rise. I hunted this monster endlessly because I just enjoyed the flow of combat with it, not to mention that it also looks just absolutely gorgeous. The personality that they gave it of like a full-on demented serial killer bear wandering the map at night, and then because they're Capcom, they still put in cute shit like this for him, where one of his little idle animations is him just scratching his back on a wall, which is something that I've done myself in real life more times than I should probably be admitting in public. Up next in second place, we have Zamtrios. I will always absolutely love this monster from the bottom of my heart, and from the rest of my heart too. Sharks are cool, that's just a fact of life. But what if you take a shark and then make it swim underneath the ice with its fin sticking out, not only letting it have more straight up shark-like personality, but then also giving it the terrifying factoid that it can straight up swim through solid ice being broken with its fin because it is just that strong or sharp or whatever you want to call it. Through the fight though, he will eventually enter his ice armor mode as you beat on him, covering himself in a sheet of ice-like armor like he's preparing for battle in the Shark Wars, and this shit just looks cool as all hell. And then just when you're really getting settled in and comfortable with the idea that this monster specifically is one of the cool and edgy ones, because generally speaking in Monster Hunter, they will always make each monster lean either towards being cool and edgy or more towards being silly and fanciful. But Zamtrios smashes that barrier, he obliterates it to pieces, because just when you accept he probably isn't going to be a silly monster because he's a cool monster that had a second phase that made him even cooler, he then has a third phase where he expands to the size of a fucking boulder filled with air, and he looks like Jabba the Hutt wearing a shark-themed Halloween costume. And not only do I love it every time that I see it, but of course the first time I saw this happen is one of the most memorable times in all of my hours spent playing through the Monster Hunter series in general, and completely expanded my mind on what a Monster Hunter monster could really be. Then finally in the number one slot, if you know me, you knew the answer. It is Duramboros. I mean, just look at this guy. He's just like a giant cow monster brute wyvern at a glance, but he eats trees, which I like a lot for some reason that I struggle to explain. He has these like camel-like humps full of nutrients, and he is absolutely covered in moss and greenery, making him feel like such a natural creature. Like, sure, some monsters in the series can almost give off genetically modified vibes, but Duramboros is the opposite of that, almost like a 1,000-year-old giant preserved in some tiny corner of the woods that went undiscovered this whole time. But then combine that with the fact that he just has this little peaceful, tranquil smile on his face all the time, and the fact that 90% of his moveset is just him spinning around, trying to either hit you with his hammer-shaped tail, or trying to use the momentum of it like a freaking helicopter to shoot up into the sky and then land on you with his full body weight as one of his biggest attacks. He is slow, he is deliberate, but his moveset is so unbelievably unique from every other monster in the series, and in such a silly way too. And the entire time that he is spinning and jumping, he just has that same little peaceful smile on his face, and it just makes it seem like, to him, this isn't a fight, not even slightly. He's just having a fun day out with his hunter friend. He's not going to eat you, he eats trees. This isn't really combat to him. This isn't life or death. He's just expressing his excitement by spinning and jumping and trying to stay close to you, you know? And in a lot of ways, he has a similar design style to Zamtrios, by which I mean, when you first look at Duramboros, do you think he's silly? He looks like this massive, imposing monster of a creature, and then he starts spinning, and okay, that's definitely, it's a little bit silly, but it sort of makes sense because of the weight distribution of his body, and then he starts spinning fast enough to make him fly into the air, and then the full sense of silly washes over in a beautiful wave. He's just perfect, and while I'd be happy if Duramboros stayed my favorite monster forever, of course, I do look forward to Wilds, and I will always remain open in my admiration of new monsters to finding a potentially new favorite in the future. That just about does it for today then, everyone. One final roundup of my 10 top favorite monsters and what makes them so special to me personally before we dive into Wilds on release, and of course what gives these monsters their place in my heart. Obviously this list is my own personal opinions, and it should give you some idea of how I'm going to feel about new monsters in Wilds too, but feel free to tell me that I'm wrong about my feelings on any of these, because I'm avoiding spoilers for Wilds anyway, so I won't be reading these comments for over a week regardless. So take that, Duramboros haters. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.